Hey, this is Zach.
And I'm Clint, and we wanted to thank Exo Terra for sponsoring this episode of Colubrid and Colubroid Radio.
Exo Terra is the industry leader in glass terrarium enclosures, and we are a big fan of getting to see the species we work with both at home and at the university.
We utilize Exo Terra caging here at Metazotics, and in addition to top quality terrariums, Exo Terra offers an array of heating options, lighting, supplements, decor, and truthfully anything needed or wanted when keeping reptiles.
Thank you, Exo Terra, for supporting Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 57 of Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. As always, Zach is here, and my good bud Clint is here. So, how you doing, man?
I'm doing fantastic. How you doing, Zach?
You know how I'm doing. Past 2 days at work.
We've talked a lot.
Yes. Past 2 days of work have been a little bit brutal, so I am looking forward to tonight. Nerd out time with reptiles is my favorite time. But anyway, so tonight we have Steve Sotelo from Exo Terra with us. And we're going to be talking about UVB lighting. This is something...
UVB, UVA, UVC, LED. We're talking about reptile lighting. That's probably the best way to...
the whole thing.
Yes.
And what's kind of fun is all the way back to episode 1, when I was talking with Matt at the time, I said one of the topics we will hit head on is reptile lighting and UVB specifically when it comes to colubrid snakes, because there's kind of been this idea historically that they probably don't need it based off some science. And then there's been some recent science that shows that it definitely leads to increased vitamin D in the bloodstream when they receive it. And that's what most animals that need UVB use it for. And so I'm really looking forward to tonight. So if you've ever wondered about lights, lighting, heating, and of course the UVB element when it comes to colubrids, tonight is your night. So we will be getting on to that. But as our podcast grows, our intro grows. I've noticed. So, the little update used to be 10 minutes, and now it's like 30, 35 minutes because we got a lot going on. So I will say that since tonight is literally a science episode, we're not going to be doing the science update tonight, but the next episode, I have one already lined up that I think is super interesting. So that's that. But my updates, I don't really have that many updates. I'm just waiting for things to hatch. Things are finally hatching here at the school. The first 30, 2024 false water cobras are on the ground. And I will be looking to move those relatively quickly. So if you're in the market for a false water cobra, please hit me up now. When you listen to this, listeners get a listener price. So I will say that. So I have those. We had our hundreds and literally hundreds of king snakes started hatching. I even told Clint that. So those will be in the box that's heading your way next week. So we have hogs on the ground too. And then I think I had my last clutch hit yesterday. I don't know. Some things may have double clutched, but I mentioned in an earlier episode, everybody that listens routinely knows that king snakes are my jam right now. And I have several localities of kings from across the country, and I have a couple that are kind of notorious for being, for king snakes anyway, a little bit difficult to get a clutch out of. And I have gotten, I knocked those things out of the park. And then California king snakes, which are quite literally the beginner's snake to breed next to corns, have just kicked my ass this year. I mean, thrashed me. And so I had a mud king ready to drop, and I don't think I have pulled a tub as much in the past 5 years as I did this king out of pure spite because I was not going to lose another Cali King clutch. So those eggs all hit last night, nice. and they're beautiful, big old veins, nice big embryos. So I'm not very good at saying the locality out loud, but the Montero del Rey, Mud King locale, the Hypermel looking animals, but they're not
Right.
technically hypermales. That would be it. So I'm happy for that. And that's kind of it. I've been spending most of my time focused on Colubrid Fest, which we will talk about here shortly, and getting talks all arranged and presentations and even figuring out what the talk format's going to be. But more on that in a minute. So that's my update. What's up with you, dude?
Well, first off, had a great 4th of July and 4th of July weekend. I hope you guys did too.
Nice. We did.
That was a good time. The kids are now at that age where I can hand them the long lighter and let them go light some things off to go boom. So, but you have to keep yelling at them one at a time, quit trying to light 4 at a time, that type of thing. But no, that was a great time. Here, at the shop, we're over 400 babies at this point. And we're averaging about 4 clutches pipping a day, type of thing. And, we're having very, very positive results right out of the gate on feeding. So very high percentage on first tries. So I was just talking to Drew about that. It was funny because I think he said he pulled 60 hoppers to feed the ball python side.
Yep.
So we've got about 60 ball python hatchlings so far. And he goes, I'm only putting 9 hoppers back, which, I mean, for a first round of feeding, that's pretty good odds, right out of the gate. Good. So I'm like, sweet, man. Some of those snakes I literally just popped and set up individually today, so that wasn't bad. I have had some, it's, as with every season, you've got your wins and your losses. Yeah. And I'm noticing this season, I'm having a few more bad eggs or eggs go bad in the incubator. And I'm thinking that, and this could be a combination. It's one of two things or a combination of the two. I think maybe we've got our eggs a little too wet this season. Okay. Like, too humid in there.
That was our problem last year.
I'm pretty sure it's that, but I think it's compounded because I also have this particular incubator hacked. Like, I mean, Zach, you couldn't fit a fart in there, man. It's there's so many egg tubs. And so I'm thinking that maybe because I have the bottom that circulate the air in like a circle. And I'm thinking, maybe that's the air's not really getting pushed to the same degree because we literally have it so full. So that's something that obviously I'm taking note of and making some adjustments, next season.
That's interesting.
Go a little drier, and as long as I'm checking the eggs regularly, if they start dimpling in or something, we can always add some humidity to it. So I am, having more bad eggs this year than normal. I'm also, I can tell that Steve is feeding those snakes and feeding them well, because every day he's pulling a double clutch that we did not breed for.
On. Yep.
And, that I did not try for any double clutches this season whatsoever. I wasn't after. I usually don't personally.
Yeah, I don't.
Bamboo rat snakes, things like that, I will throughout because, it can go all year with most of them. But king snake after king snake, black rat after black rat, just double. Most of those eggs are bad. But speaking of, I did get a double clutch on gray bands and they were bad. And so after the story you had told about the hog nose, I bet you can guess where these eggs went.
To your hog?
Yeah, absolutely. I got to see some hoggies take some bad snake eggs. So that was pretty neat. Have had some wins though, as far as hatchling. So we have had some green bush rats hatch.
Nice.
That's always probably my favorite clutch of the year to see Pip. I only got 2 out of this 5 egg clutch. I think there were 6 eggs that were laid. 4 looked okay. 2 ended up hatching, type of thing. And that seems to be a commonality, with those for me. I have some good years on them, some better, but that's still a work in progress, I guess. I also hatched out 2 albino Eastern kings.
Oh, nice.
So I have a couple het.
I didn't even know you had het Easterns.
Yeah. Yeah. And I had one visual that she should be big enough next year. Cool. So now I just hatched out 2. I haven't sexed them or anything, but pretty excited about that. Those are
that's a cool
neat ones. So, but yeah, things are going well. We are obviously still in that prep mode for the anniversary sale that's happening next month. And as exciting as it is, and I can tell you, I try to stock up pretty heavy on everything in preparation for that, and it kills my soul to write those checks, so to speak. Every time it was, oh gosh, like, all right, this better work, kind of thing. But we're making sure that it's going to be a big one for all of our customers. So exciting stuff. But
very, very cool.
Yeah, things going well.
I actually need to go back to my update, and I want to give somebody at Westlib mad props. So last year I had the problem you did. I don't know if you remember all the way back to then, but the big issue that we had here is that it's my fault. I'm claiming responsibility. I had a couple people in charge of the eggs, and I thought I explained to them how to do this, because for people that do eggs all the time, Colubrid eggs, it's like rinse, recycle, repeat. We don't think about it. But if you kind of go back to your very first clutch, you overthink everything. And I've run into issues with some of my students being very literal in interpreting my instructions. And I had mentioned back in 2023, you need to make sure there's a little bit of water in the bottom of the egg tub, which then translated to a good 2 inches of water in the egg tub, which then led to mold. And, we lost like 50% of the eggs, 40, I think it may have been more. So anyway, going into it this year, it's like all about redemption, right? And so I was like, how the hell am I going to fix this? And we have a student. He's a non-traditional student. His name is Derek Garner. I know he listens to the show, so this is all about you, bud. And he was a retic breeder, and he came here to basically get a degree in Zoosci. And I was thinking, like, how are we going to do this? How are we going to fix this? Derek. So I paid Derek to be our egg guy, and I think we're sitting at about 85 to 90% of the eggs are hatching.
Nice.
And the big thing was he monitors our incubators like you would not believe for humidity, and he checks the tubs routinely to see the water levels. And last year, I think that we had like 40 to 50 hogs hatch, and I was just told we've already had 45 hogs hatch. Nice. And the ladies are dropping their double clutches now, and we're looking at about 100 to 150 hog year. And if that excites some of you, a lot of those are going to Clint.
Must say it excites one of us.
Yes. So, and then the king snakes, I mean, there are literally, I think, I've said it before, I believe we're over 500 king snake eggs for that research project. So, and the reason why this is happening is we got Derek, and he's awesome. He comes in the morning, he comes in the afternoon, and there's been many times where I've come down the hallway and I'm like, think I'm the only person here at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. And there's Derek and his wife walking down the hallway. So I greatly appreciate that. And it just kind of, it turned our season around from last year exponentially, like literally exponentially. So that's your shout out, Derek. So good job, man.
Good job, Derek.
There you go. Yeah. Clint's saying good job too, for many reasons. Okay. So that's our updates. I think we should move on to the market update.
Yep.
And I know you're prepared for tonight. So
yeah, absolutely. So it's been a week since the last time we recorded, so you guys know this is going to come out about a week after we're recording right now. But we're seeing the exact trend that I expected, that I mentioned previously. So we had, in just a week's time, the ball python market, according to Morph Market, let's see, there's a 35 snake drop. So 35 snakes off, which is just a 0.1% change. Because, ball pythons are still almost 33,000, are listed. All other pythons, there was actually a 1.8% increase. So 34 more were listed. Boas had a 1.4% increase with 70 more listed. Colubrids had a 1.9% increase with 84 listed. So in short, 3 out of the 4 categories, so 3 out of the 4 snake categories that we're looking at all increased. So we're there. We're now at that point of the season where that's probably going to happen very regularly, week over week, at this point. And to break down the colubrids for us all, let's see, corn snakes had a 15 snake drop. So 1.3% from the week before. Hognose had 74 more hognose listed, so a 4.8% increase. They led the charge. All other colubrids combined had a 25 snake increase, so 1.4% for that particular category. So we are now, we'll mark this because obviously we're going to watch for these trends come next year. And it looks like roughly the second week of July are when it really starts to hit. Now, hopefully that doesn't just slap me in the face next week and we see sudden drops across the board again, but I doubt that's going to be the case. I think we're going to continue to see that lift. And while talking about the market, obviously we need to thank Show Me Reptile Show for being the market update sponsor. Show Me's marketplace is now live and launched. It is another online marketplace where you can buy and sell reptiles. If you're a Show Me vendor, you already have an account with them. If you are not, you just have to kind of go through a verification process, which is pretty cool because the sellers and buyers both have to go through a verification process to be able to use the platform. So it kind of weeds out a lot of the scammers, things like that. So pretty cool. Check it out. And if you're wanting to get out to a show, let's see, Show Me has in Millbrook, Alabama on July 13th. They'll be in Roanoke, Virginia on July 14th. Boise, Idaho, Shelbyville, Kentucky, and Tampa, Florida, all on the 20th. They will have their flagship show at St. Louis on the 21st, Atlanta on the 27th, as well as Odessa, Texas on the 27th. So get out and support them because, as you know, they support us. And not only do they support the show, hell, they're supporting Colubrid Fest more than we could have ever imagined. So
you don't.
So show them some love.
Yeah.
We'll go ahead and jump into the Colubrid Fest update if that works for you, Zach. So a few things. The big question that we're getting asked a lot is the hotel block. And I'm in contact with Mickey nearly daily. And we're talking about that, and he is still waiting for this confirmation from a hotel or hotels. So no, we do not have the hotel block as of this recording. So that could change before this recording goes out. However, I will give everyone a piece of advice if you're wanting to ensure that you get a room and you can book your hotel now, book a hotel now. Just ensure that it's a refundable hotel because that way you're safe. You've got your travel booked. When the hotel block comes out, you can always switch over to that hotel. You can decide whether the discount is worth the change, if that's a hotel you want to be at, all those little things. So just as a piece of advice, there's nothing wrong with booking a hotel early as long as you're doing it in a format that it can be refunded. A lot of times travel agencies, things like that, that's not the case. So just kind of a word to the wise from someone who used to travel 4 or 5 days a week for years and years. I would go ahead and go that route if I were you. The other piece on Colubrid Fest is actually going to jump over to Zach because I know you've been really kind of working hard on ensuring these talks that are going to take place are going to be pretty impressive. So what do you got for us, bud? So
as a reminder, Saturday, I don't know of any reptile show that's done this, but we're going to basically have a little, we don't really know what to call it. We want to call it a symposium, but we don't want to call it a symposium. We just like talks. But talks implies that you're going to come, you're going to sit in a chair, somebody's going to give a lecture, and then you're going to ask questions. And that's actually not what we want to do because I'm a teacher. I know what happens when you get in front of somebody and talk to them for 50 minutes, and their job is to sit there and receive the data. That works for some people, great. For most people, you reach a point, especially in the world we live in today with all the immediate gratification that we have where you're kind of like zonking out. And I don't want that to happen. And plus, we really want this to be about you all, and we really want you to get what you want out of it. And so Clint and I put our heads together, and we're trying to figure out how to make this talk day way more interactive. And so what we've come up with is we are not going to be necessarily having talks on the captive care of gray bands. Like, that's not what a talk is going to be. What we're going to do, though, is make it so that gray bands can be a part of any talk. And so we are picking situational type subjects where we're going to have one presentation on how do you set up a project. So you want to bring in a snake from South America. How do you make sure you're bringing it in legally? How do you decide the total number of animals you need? How do you decide when to worm and do vet care? How do you decide how to make other people care about what you're doing? How do you move forward with breeding? How many of those animals you produce do you need to keep back? Well, we have plenty of people that have been in the circle of Colubrid and Colubroid since its inception that can answer that. So what we're going to do with these so-called talks is I want you to think of it more like a panel kind of scenario where we're going to have basically each guest is going to have the floor for about 20 minutes to maybe a half an hour with a classic PowerPoint or YouTube videos or, something to basically kind of put the data out there for you to receive it. And then we're going to turn it over to you all and to us. And then we're going to make it almost like a panel discussion. So then we can ask a question in real time, foster a conversation, and then we'll have people running around the audience with microphones so that if you are sitting there and you're like, whoa, but what about this? We'll then be able to hand that mic over to, people in the audience to then ask the questions. And then to be brutally honest, we will absolutely have canned questions ready to go to kind of keep the conversation going. But I thought that this would make it a lot more engaging because there's audience participation for the bulk of the day. And right now we are thinking about somewhere in the neighborhood of the low end 5 talks, the high end 8 to 9 talks on various subjects. And so what we're going to do in future episodes is we will slowly over time release what those subjects are to kind of get you all excited and jazzed. Because the other thing is, if you know what the subjects are, you can be thinking about, oh, that person's given that talk. I always wanted to ask them X. And so that kind of makes it so you're primed and ready, and you can basically be getting ready for this incredibly awesome day we're going to have when we do this conversational piece. And so,
I think you said the most important part of what really Colubrid Fest as a whole is. And when you said we're wanting to foster conversation.
Yes, that's it.
That's it. That's really what this entire event is for, is to foster conversation, to share ideas, to, open up to new ventures kind of things. So that's what we were after. We want to ensure that we're going to make this engaging, make this fun, make this something where, when you walk, a guy who came from a corporate environment for the last 20 years, one thing I will say that I will have to tip my hat to that environment is whenever we would have our district meetings or our brand meetings type of thing, I can tell you, we always walked out of there jazzed.
Yep.
Pumped up, right? Ready to go do these things that we just talked about. And that's kind of the feeling I want, everyone who gets to listen to these presentations, I want them to walk out of there thinking, I really can't wait to go home and try that.
Yeah, that's the point.
I can't wait to go do this. You know what I mean? That's what I'm after.
And one thing I come from the academic side. Everybody knows that. And I've gone to conferences and I've walked out with that exact feeling. I will say, and I know there's people listening that are academically inclined that may disagree with me, but when you're in that kind of academic environment, it's you give a 12-minute talk, there's 3 minutes of questions, you then move on to the next 12-minute talk, there's 3 minutes of questions, you then move on to the next 12-minute talk, there's 3 minutes of questions, we got a 20-minute break, and by the end of that, oftentimes, even though this is crayfish biology, which is my jam, there have definitely been days where it's at the end of the day and I'm like, I'm tired. And I don't want that. I don't want people paying money for that. That's not what this is about. I want people leaving jazz. And so that's why we thought this kind of conversational, factual panel approach is probably way more lucrative and way more what people actually want. And then the other thing it does is, let's be real, a lot of reptile people are wallflowers. We both are wallflowers. You would. Everybody says they don't believe that. You watch. I've said it a million times. Watch me at a wedding where there's no herp talk, and I am not talking to anybody. And I usually have an expression on my face like "Get the hell away from me." I mean, I technically had an expression on my face at Tinley when I got tired of "Get the hell away from me," and I like those people. So we don't want that going on with this. So the other thing is, this will then hopefully get people to kind of come out of their shell a little bit. So then when those breaks happen, conversations happen. So we're just trying to foster that kind of collaborative environment. So that's the goal with the talks. So with that being said, and this has been working, so keep them coming. Fire off the ideas that you have. Now, I will say we have 5 talks already. And when we tell you this lineup, I know you're all going to be geeked because I'm geeked with the lineup we have so far. But we got some heavy hitters in Colubrid land coming to spread the good word of their discipline. So, but there's still room for a couple more. So, throw those topics at me, and I will think about it. Luke, is this something the hive mind wants? And if it is, okay, we'll move forward and potentially pursue that person. Okay. Are we good with our updates or
I think so. I think let's get into what we came here for.
All right, cool. So our guest tonight is Steve Sotelo. He is the Exo Terra U.S. brand manager. He is the guy that has talked to Clint, and I'm going to kind of pass this off to Clint to kind of get the reasoning behind why Steve is with us tonight. And I am incredibly excited to talk to Steve as well.
Oh, absolutely. So, when you just mentioned, Zach, way back in the beginning, you had stated that a UVB talk has to take place. And, one of the things I'm kind of excited about, I don't want to say I'm excited that one didn't take place back then, but I think even back then to now, there's the discussion is bigger, broader.
Yeah, it is.
And, better understood. And so whenever you had mentioned to me, I think it was about 5-6 weeks ago, that, hey, we really need to do a UVB talk because you and I continue to talk about UVB and lighting, with Colubrids. Every episode it gets brought up. And so when Zach said that to me, I said, you know what? I think I know who I'd like to have come on. And it was Steve, because Steve and I had a conversation. Obviously we've got a relationship with Exo Terra. We sure love do. The brand. We love the product and what they're doing. But the reason I wanted Steve specifically is because we had a long conversation at the last Tinley about this very thing. UVB, UVA, UVC, LED, the whole shebang. And I was extremely impressed with Steve's level of knowledge. And I mean, this is coming from someone who 2 years ago, I knew nothing about UVB because we didn't need it. Right. Yeah. And so, I didn't know. But then when, I opened the shop with all the bearded dragons, all the lizards, all of this. And so now I've really had to grow my knowledge base on it. And, I think there's still so much there that continues to just jump leaps and bounds. It seems like monthly. So, again, when Zach mentioned that, I'm like, you know what? I think I know who I'd love to bring on. And, I think that this is going to be a very interesting, and educational, experience for us all. So welcome, Steve.
Well, thanks, gentlemen. Appreciate you having me on and the hefty introduction. Very, very excited to chat about this and how I think some of these things apply to what you deal with on a day-to-day basis, but more just kind of clearing things up in general. We can do a 4-hour podcast on UV lighting and lighting in general, right? But it's I think it's you almost have to deconstruct it in order to explain it in a digestible format. So hopefully I can do that without getting too far into the weeds. But overall, I'm pretty excited to just open up the floor and, really, I guess, offer some transparency about what we're doing as a brand, what we see in the industry, where it's going, and then certainly some of the challenges that the industry overall is facing, including our own brand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Well, so, I'll tell you, before we jump, into that, obviously let's get to know Steve a little bit, right? Yeah. So So Steve, what's your background with reptiles? How'd you get into them? What's the story there?
You keeping them now?
What's that?
Are you keeping them now?
Yeah. Yeah, they never really go away. The second you start to, lose projects, you end up picking up a new one from time to time. But, I think it's been one of those, mine starts the same as everyone else's, right? My dad taught me how to noose catch Western fence lizards when I was 2 or 3 years old, and, cried like a baby when they bit me, but it was exciting until that happened. But, so yeah, I can't really remember too much of my early life where I wasn't, fascinated or played with them or went camping and interacted with wildlife. But then it started to become a lot more serious, right? It was the Wild West in the 80s, in the early 80s when it came to pet stores. Like you had everything. And it's so unfortunate that we sit here now with probably never having to see some of these animals that we had access to back then. But that's the world we're living in right now. But yeah, I came on board, started doing a lot of small scale breeding just on my own. It was something I could do, right? Buying chicken incubators, trying to incubate leopard geckos in the late 80s, early 90s. Transitioned over and then went to college and decided to keep a good chunk of my collection with myself in college and some at my parents' place. And that kind of parlayed over into the internet boom. And during that time when people were really starting to ship reptiles nationally, the internet was, you had all your normal, it was just a blank page with a word on, a couple words on it and a list, right? We used to get those back then. No pictures. You just had to know what the scientific name was, and you hope you had a book that had a picture in it. I remember those days, became really friendly with some importers and some early online businesses, managed a business while I was still in college. Then that went into Rolf C. Hagen company, came on board and asked my company at the time to kind of help out with the launch of Exo Terra as far as having a national platform goes. So it's really, really exciting at that point and being in the infancy stages of a big brand coming by that had certainly a global feel for what reptile keeping was. It was very, very different than what I had experienced before in the U.S. industry. So pretty excited about that. And then, many, many years later, 10 to 15 years later, came on board for the brand management side of things for the U.S., kind of a little bit of a shepherd or a steward for the brand to, figure out what the U.S. business needed and overall offer some insight into, the experiences that I had when it comes to brick and mortar, internet retail, trade show, breeding, overall public interaction, going into that. So kind of fell into it, I should say. I certainly didn't go to college for this, but I find myself in it now, and it's still exciting to me. Some of the strengths that I didn't realize that I had back on the animal side of things, I can use now towards more of the technical side and the, the product development side. But yeah, I'm excited to really get in front of people and move the industry forward instead of trying to keep it in its place.
No, that's pretty cool.
I like that.
So in regards to moving it forward with lighting, this is, I teach lighting, advanced lighting methods. We go into all the different, wavelengths and in my herpetoculture class, and I have students that listen to this, and I know right now they're probably face palming or quivering in the corner. I make them do the hardcore physiological pathways with the, from cholesterol and the UV radiation all the way down to what's going on in livers and kidneys and all that stuff. But if you were going to explain to someone who doesn't have to take a test, who's just trying to kind of understand the bare bones basics of what UVA is, what UVB is, what UVC is, do you kind of have a way of doing that with people?
Yeah, I've done a lot of training sessions when it comes to the retail side, and I've done some mass public speaking, and you almost have to speak to your audience. Right. Like you and I, the three of us could have a conversation, as I said, that could go on for 4 hours. I think ultimately when we look at it as a very limited slices of a single pie. If the tough thing with lighting in general is you have to keep yourself from talking about all of it, right? Between short range and long range, we start going into infrared and then the different types of infrared. And from I don't think as an industry we've done the public a service of explaining that in the right way. From a competitive set, I think sometimes it's really easy to go, our lighting is better because of this. Our lighting does this, and brand X doesn't do that. Versus, I think that's incredibly counterproductive when we get into UV lighting in general. So the thing that we really have to look at is eliminating the problem sets when it comes to product development, and then overall trying to comfort people into understanding, like, listen, guys, we're also looking into this. We're not launching a product for the sake of doing it because it's plugging a hole in the industry. So when it comes to UV in general, the big buzzword's always UVC, right?
Yep.
UVC, we know the damage it does to eyesight. We know the damage it does to DNA. And these are all things that are extremely accumulative. They're really difficult to take into account, like right now in the space that we're in, right? And that can be a little tough too. I think then let me go back to metering and doing either lab grade spectrometers, or just going over handheld and some of the problems that go along with that too. But so we've got the boogeyman, we've got the UVC problem, which is very, very relevant. Then we've got UVB, and if we look at terrestrial UVB, right, which is a very small amount of UV radiation that is hitting the surface of our planet, it's only really about 10% of what's hitting, right? And this is, it's plus or minus, it's in that range. But if you look at how powerful and relevant UVB radiation is to our overall vertebrate health, and to realize that the majority of it is getting blocked, ozone blockage, or foliage, or environmental things like humidity or rainfall. Like there's very small amounts of it that hits our surface, whether that's us or whether it's reflected surfaces. It's a small amount, and then the majority of that is UVA. And I think that part of it gets left out of the conversation to a huge degree. It's incredibly important, and it's almost an afterthought. And if we're looking at UV radiation, right, almost all of UVC is blocked by the ozone layer, almost all of it. But when we get into UVA, there are things that are anecdotal. There are behavioral things, again, cumulative. Like, we got to look at these studies that take a long time. But when you look at breeding behaviors, right, when you start looking at how animals perceive each other, how they perceive their environment, how they perceive prey, and we're oftentimes either not providing that level of radiation when it comes to artificial lighting, or we're not talking about it enough because of how important it is. Now, all of that being said, it is becoming a bigger topic now than it ever has before. The amount of information that's, whether you're on forums, whether you're just following experts, whether you're in the academic field and teaching about it, it is becoming incredibly more relevant. So back to when I talked about metering and overall gauging the levels of that all of these are presented in lighting, I think that you got to take everything with a grain of salt. And sometimes when we look at how you measure lighting, what we have found is, whether it's a handheld meter or not, you're measuring a range. And oftentimes there are peaks and valleys in that range that are incredibly important. And when you err on the side of, for example, let's talk about like short wavelength UVB, right? Short wavelength UVB, which is measurable by a meter, but it's just giving you a UVB reading, right? And some of us are familiar with like UVI meters or Ferguson meters or UVB in, microwatts per square centimeter. Because they're measuring a broader range, it's not really telling you the story. You're just kind of like, well, it's still showing a value. It's only depreciated by a couple points. My UVB light is still okay. I'm good for another 6 months, 8 months, whatever it might be. But if we're erring on the side of short wavelength UVB, that really starts to go into the UVC territory. But a UVC meter will not measure that, because it's still in the UVB range, right? Like, it's to get a little nerdy on that, that's also problematic, because we have to explain that type of stuff. We have to really look at the impacts of that. And what we found is we try to stay away from this is going to sound bad until I bring it back into something, until I bring it back. We try to spend less time on the pet side of things than we do on the science side. If we look at research, and if we look at like zoos, for example, or large scale breeding, that we'll often find out like, oh, this is progressing a lot quicker than what the pet keeping side is doing. And then we could kind of use that into the product development side, and we can use that into a lot of our care guides, for example, or the apps that we do for UVB and UVA lighting. So when we're talking about that UVC thing, I think it is an issue. I think we're relatively insulated from it overall. But we do look at the little things where, as a manufacturer, Exo Terra is saying, like, guys, don't forget that short wavelength UVB is also a problem. And if you're not careful and you haven't vetted your product properly, or you haven't done your lab studies or independent studies, this is going to be a problem later on. But, you know, I don't know, Zach, if you guys have really spent this much time on the university level, but, you know, when you start looking at that razor's edge between UVB and UVC, you will often get metabolic bone disease that happens. Mm-hmm. So it's a problem, but again, it's not going to happen overnight. So you might have a UVB bulb that seems fine. You've been using it for years, but if you're not catching that range, that bad range, and your UVB lighting isn't as precise as it can be problematic. Might not be in a week, might be 2 years. But it is, you know, it is something that we watch as a brand, and we're constantly evolving and catching as we do further and further product development.
Yeah, no. Here at the school, we admittedly use all kinds of brands of lights, and you know, we have people running around with UV meters, and we have a tendency to do the Ferguson index. And if we're talking like way nerdy right now, let's kind of give some definitions here. Ferguson was a professor at a university in Texas. We'll leave it there. I think I know the university, but I don't want to say it and be wrong. So anyway, and he studied chameleons, panther chameleons to be precise. And one of the things that he was really interested in was egg development and maturation, like basically the life cycle of these chameleons. And this was back in the like 80s and 90s. And he is credited in a lot of books and a lot of journals and a lot of veterinary circles as the kind of the grandfather, if you will, that the progenitor that looked at radiation of light in the pineal gland of lizards, and basically was like, hey, there's this like wavelength of light. It's referred to as ultraviolet B. And I'm noticing that when this is denied them inside, we get metabolic bone disease, and we don't really get egg production where we need it to be. And then when we give them the UVB radiation, suddenly the legs firm up, the vertebrae get stronger, and now we've got like fecundity, which is the number of eggs you're laying out the wazoo. And so he kind of found that, and then he realized that there's all these different crazy measurements that come out when you're trying to do this. And so he simplified it. And so he came up with this scale of like 1 to 4, 1 to 4 or 1 to 7. I can't remember off the top of my head. And then made it so that anybody can understand this with giving it about 30 minutes of their attention. And that is what makes this man a legend in my book. And no one in herpetoculture talks about him, by the way. But he is literally why, when you say high UVB, low UVB, UVB of 1 to 3, UVB 2 to 4, that's the Ferguson index. And that's based off of him taking a very complicated bit of physics, to be brutally honest, and reducing it down to a scale that pretty much anybody can understand. And so the higher the UVB, the more UVB you're getting. So if you go and kind of look at light bulbs, for a while there, we would say things like desert. Well, that's branding to make it so that you can like think desert, light, hot, and then shade dweller. You know, that's lower on the Ferguson index and things like that. So that's that. But just so everybody gets it, UVB does not necessarily, the wavelengths of light, the energy it's giving off, you don't feel it in the form of heat. It's at the wavelength where you're not receiving heat. UVA is what produces, when you're out in the sun and you feel like you're baking, that's because you are. You have UVA. And what happens is the wavelengths of light in the UVA spectrum are such that they're able to basically hit you and penetrate into you because of the wavelength. And so when you get that deep penetrative, wow, I'm hot outside, that's the UVA. And I just want everybody listening to this to think about what the hell a basking reptile needs. And the physiologists have done this really cool research to show there's got to be something that the reptile receives that's positive. So like, just like when you put your hand on a stove and it goes ouchie, that's a negative thing. You evolve that. Well, with these animals, we now know that when that UVA is hitting them, it causes these endorphins to hit. And so it literally makes them feel good. Mm-hmm. So when you don't give your reptile UVA, which is associated with visible light, they literally don't feel good. And that is why when you actually understand the science and you hear people say like, oh, they don't need lights. I hear that and I'm like, they evolved a freaking endorphin pathway, dude. Like they need the damn light. So, that's the kind of stuff that we teach here at the university. We've never gone that deep with this before. I really hope we're all still with us. But anyway, but that's why when we talk about like everybody goes UVB. Steve hit it. I'm more interested in UVA. I think UVA is the coolest stuff on Earth. And I can tell you, I don't care what species of reptile it is, you get a different behavioral response when you give them access to that radiation. So
yeah. And we've been, we had kind of tend to take a step back a little bit. So back in 2012 is when we launched it. So we were really early on into providing. You mentioned the Ferguson thing too, which is kind of funny because I was going to go into one of my other topics too. So in 2012, we started including lighting charts on all of our products. Yes. That wasn't just, so we included our UVA, our UVB, our Lux. Some of them had lumens, right? We included the overall heat provided by that lamp, if it provided heat at that given moment. We provided our D3 production in international units. Like we gave everything. And there's some of it is like, there's no such thing as bad information. There's bad news, but there's no such thing as bad information, right? So you could collect all that and then use it as necessary. And we're kind of happy that now this is becoming a broader topic when it comes into Ferguson or UVI, depending on how you digest that information. We kind of looked at it as a, there are things that are tied to it, right? Nutrition, we got to tie nutrition and supplementation over into lighting. But then again, we'll go out into the weeds if we get too far off track from that. But it is important when we look at how reptiles and avians to a degree too, visualize light, right? Yes. And we look at photoreceptors and we look at cones and we look at how they view things differently. So we thought we were so ahead of the game. We launched something called Reptile Vision, which was almost exclusively a UVA bulb back in 2012. And it was an appetite stimulating bulb. It was an overall like a natural activity booster. And our results were amazing and the public never got it. Like it was just one of those, it was, okay, so what does this do? And we're like, we're telling you this was what it'll do. And, you're at the store level too. When you look at this stuff, right? Like how many people come in and say, my bearded dragon's lazy. It doesn't do anything. Sits in the corner and eats and poops. I'll tell you this, your animal shouldn't be doing that all day. Like I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but the higher the activity level of the animal, the more it's exploring. Like your animal should be curious, even if it's in the same environment, whether it's confined or bigger. It is at some degree always going to be curious as far as what's happening in that enclosure environment. And a lot of that can be, basically can be done with the correct level of lighting. So when we looked into that visualization on how reptiles were perceiving their environment, I got to tell you, as a brand, sometimes we pat ourselves on the back a little too early. It's always like we're sometimes 5 or 10 years too early, but it's kind of nice to push that envelope because we should be thinking about these things behaviorally. And I know you guys had mentioned it prior to me jumping on the call on your fecundity rates, the size of the neonates, and we're looking at clutch size, how quickly they hatch, the overall depth of the shells, right? Like we as keepers and as in the science community really take those things into account. The average person may not, but it is beneficial that we look at all of those things as a whole. And for the UVA side of things, I'm pretty confident that will be more relevant moving forward. There are a lot of challenges in regards to what's available from us from the science side. There's a lot of challenges when it comes to regulatory things, whether it's lighting in general, or it's just materials, right? Like there might be some materials later on that we just cannot use as an industry. And well, woe is me, what are we going to do? And we kind of have to be ahead of the curve on that. And it can't just be, this is a UVB bulb. This is great for your bearded dragon. This is great for your chameleon. Trust us. Let's move forward. But you're right when it comes to, for lack of a better term, nomenclature in how we sell our products. We've been guilty of this too. We are one of the big reasons why the whole 0.0 system continued to evolve, right? Like I think we did an 8.0. Oh my God, it's like 20 years ago that ended up turning into like a 10.0. But ultimately, I mean, to this day, I can't fully explain it without going too far off the reservation, right? Like we're trying to explain this stuff like, well, 5.0 has always been tropical for the most part. 10.0 has always been desert. And so you kind of find yourself, well, we've pigeonholed ourselves into this system, this bifurcated system almost of tropical or desert. And you gotta have to hope that your enclosure is meaningful enough where it will benefit from one or the other. But it's really interesting to see all of that. Our own guilt to play in the matter on why it can be a little confusing. But overall to kind of bring it back into the side on why this is beneficial for animals. A lot of our livelihoods on this industry, whether it comes to the science side or the breeding side, it ultimately comes down to, and it boils down to doing what's best for the animal. And if we're not giving you all the information to do what's best for your animal, we've kind of failed, right? And I don't mean just us as a brand. I mean as a reptile or pet industry or zoological industry or science industry, we're not giving you all of the facts. So we can. I don't know if you guys mind if I just go ahead on like the snake side of thing on some of the stuff that we've seen on Colubrid. So I've been asked a lot lately, and it's funny that the timing's really strange, but it's almost like you've listened into some of the conversations that I've had with people. But I think the snake community is really taking it upon itself to advance in this way. There are limits on what you can do, right? Like if you are if you're using a rack system, how do you get lighting in that, right? Also, if you're looking at environments, how do you really do it right? Even in an environment, you might have limitations on, you might have a giant, I'm going to throw a random thing. Let's say you have a giant reticulated python, for example, but you want to get that right amount of light. Are there commercial lights available to get the radiation where it's going to get down to the snake? Maybe, there are some things there, but, I was at the reptile talks a couple of weeks ago, put on in Southern California, and one of the Morelia breeders was up there, and we really got into it, not in a bad way, on UV radiation and his snakes and some of the positives that he's seen when it comes to animals. I mean, guys, let's face it. These animals are basically basking out in the public 24 hours a day, right? For lack of a better term. They're there. They're getting, whether it's direct sunlight, whether it's reflected sunlight, whether it's filtered, they're getting this stuff for huge portions of the daytime. When we start looking into New World, Old World, colubrids, for example, Asian species, even like these are animals that they're not necessarily fossorial, right? They're not buried under the ground for long periods of time. And we do see a lot of the positives on how UVA in particular, in this instance, how important it is, because they are going to get a lot of their nutrients from their prey, right? They're eating, and that's kind of been common knowledge for a while, but it doesn't hurt to go towards offering them something that they may not have had before, and overall improving their life. So we take that into account when we look at how we're providing this data to our customer base. And, more importantly, then we start looking at how they perceive each other, right? And you look at things like rainbow boas, for example, how iridescent they look, right? You look at, there's a lot of colubrids in the same way. You look at some of the UV research, like Ari Flegel used to work at DFW, or the Dallas Fort Worth Zoo, and what he's doing with Boelen's pythons and how UV affects them overall. And you're like, okay, so we're going in the right direction, right? Like you do see these weird patterns on animals. Like there's a reason it looks that way.
I can speak to that for a second. I mean, many people don't realize that the colors that snakes can see in the color spectrum is that they can see blues and they can see greens and they can see grays. And so, knowing that, and you think about something like a Pueblan milk snake, and that makes their evolution just so freaking awesome because they can't even see that they're red. But some of these wavelengths that we talk about, are, when radiation hits a snake, the snake absorbs some of it and then it reflects off of it some. And there's really interesting research that kind of shows that we're the kind of the oddballs out, being mammals that see color. That's not the way the majority of the world interprets. When I say majority of the world, I mean like the animal kingdom. Mm-hmm. Most animals are seeing in grayscale. They're seeing in the blues and the greens and that. And with these different radiations, when you give those wavelengths, it quite literally makes them see the world differently. And one of the things that really it was like a whoa moment for me when I was prepping my herpetoculture class the first time, is I was reading a bunch of research by a wonderful woman, Frances Baines, and Dr. Baines, and she's in England. One of the great moments of my herpetoculture career was when I got to meet her and at Bob Ashley's place. When you deny these animals this radiation, they are seeing the world in a different way than they see it. But we turn on that light, and it's radiating them with visible light, which is the light that we evolved to see. And so we think, oh, they're lit up, everything's well and good. Well, if you are not giving them these other wavelengths of light, they're living their life in dim, and then you sit back and you look at something like a Boeleni, which lives up on a mountain in Papua New Guinea, where there's, where the females aggregate, and Ari's talked about this, during the day, they're getting irradiated with different wavelengths of light. They may very well see a different version of the reality that they're living in, and that's what tells them it's time to breed. Yeah. So we've got these species we can't breed, and then you ask, well, what about the UV light? Oh, and then if you just give them the UV light, that's not good enough. You have to understand, go back to nature and figure out where are they on the Ferguson spectrum. Because if you and I've noticed with my students, not a negative thing, but I've got a sample size of about 400 of them now. They just think, oh, I got to get a UV light bulb. So you go get a UV light bulb, you plug it in, you're good. And oh, no.
So much to learn there. Yeah.
You can do some harm if you don't know what you're doing. Yeah. so in that world, you just made them live in a nuclear explosion. Don't have the right. And I don't think anybody wants to live in that. Yeah. So a little bit of understanding goes a long way with this stuff, but it will make you a better herpetoculturalist. I don't care who you are.
Yeah, I agree. And two things I think I want to point out. One was something that you mentioned earlier, Steve, about the bulb that you guys released in 2012 that kind of it missed with the audience, you know what I mean, so to speak, right? And that's one thing that I really am happy about with our community now.
Yes.
Is when you think about the community even 10 years ago compared to today, it seems like the reptile keeper, the general reptile keeper, has really shifted into the direction of wanting to keep better, wanting to really evolve in what they're doing. And it's because I can tell you this, and this is coming from, someone who's got the shop here. I get messages pretty frequently from individuals all over the country that are asking for release dates on products. You know what I mean? That can you get this yet kind of thing. And that excites me because that tells you how many people are paying attention to what's coming down the pipeline, what's new, what's innovative, and really wanting to take this stuff a step forward compared to where we were 10, 20, 30 years ago. It was just what was the simplest. And while, there's still a lot of us that still, we want to keep it simple, we all want to do it better, and that is exciting. I can also tell you that, I see that daily with how individuals are wanting to set up enclosures and habitats to begin with. And don't get me wrong, we're always going to have the ones that want the bare bones and that type of thing. But I can't give too much of this away. Zach, you'll know what I'm referring to. But Billy's presentation at IHS, there was a graph. And, Billy, if you're listening, I had Billy send his entire presentation to me. Now, there's things he's doing with it. I can't release this or anything like that. But I wanted it because of one specific slide that really, really stood out for me. And one of the kind of things Billy mentioned was you have like your bare, this is what you have to do so the animal lives kind of thing, right? On the other end of the spectrum, you have, this is the absolute best of any world that this animal could ever get. None of us achieve that end. But in between those two, you have the keeper's discretion, right? And I think that right there is great because you're seeing that bar, that keeper's discretion, continuously moving towards the higher end. And that's, just absolutely wonderful. Now, obviously, I cannot speak to any of the physiology, anything internally that UVA, UVB, or even UVC, does to these animals. What I can speak on is the behaviors I've seen and witnessed when putting this type of lighting on snake species, and I'm not even going to pretend that I've done it with hundreds, because I've got hundreds and that's expensive. That'll take a long time for me to be able to try this with everybody. But I will tell you, there's two species that I have done it with. I've done it with Persinum, greenbush rat snakes, or whatever the hell they're called now, Zach. And whenever I lit up the UVB on them, they immediately went over and started soaking it in. They already had, heat lights. They've got a nice big, 36, 18, 36. What is that? Extra large, tall, Exo Terra. And it decked out, but they immediately went over and started soaking that up. And so I could see a difference. And Zach, I don't even know if I told you this yet, because this was not my intention when I did it. So Zach had sent me a pair of tiger rat snakes, and the male's a big male. He's got cataracts, he's an old guy, sweetheart, he's a nice snake. Well, we finally got their cage set up, decked out, planted, all that kind of thing, which they've already destroyed the plants. So we've got to do that again. Yep. Well, I set them up with both, UVB and LED lighting, inside, because we wanted this to flourish kind of thing. And I don't know what the steps are to make this happen, but within 3 days of me setting that lighting up, and it's cycled, how it comes on, comes off, all that, he's been courting her constantly. And I don't know how easy it is to breed tiger rat snakes. I've never done it. I'd ask Jason Hood, that was my intention, is we'll try it next year and I'll see what Jason Hood tells me to do. But to see that behavior get kickstarted just after a few days of having these lights doing what they're doing, that tells me there's relevance.
Yeah.
There's something happening here, because it's kicking in this kind of behavior out of these animals.
Yep. 100%.
Yeah. It's kind of, we've noticed that too. And outside of colubrids, we've certainly noticed in chameleon species in particular, and I could kind of talk about this when it comes to LED lighting later. But certainly how they perceive. I know there've been more recent-ish studies when you look at like Burkesia species, those ground species in Madagascar, where they've shown them under a particular like UV light, and all of a sudden their scalation pattern is very different,
Totally different
than what it looks like. But it's incredible. But these things look like just dead leaves that are 18 inches off the ground, right? Like they're not really easy to pass up if you don't know what you're looking at, but they perceive each other.
Yes.
Right. They perceive each other and their prey. And, oftentimes, as you mentioned, I've always used this analogy, and maybe it's because I'm getting older and this is the only way I can really do this on how we're putting them in a gray box. It's, I remember my grandparents in their, for nighttime lighting, it was a giant red bulb in their bathroom.
Yes.
So just imagine that, like you can see, right? Like you can see what's happening. You can differentiate shapes, but you're not particularly happy being right. In there. But you hit the nail on the head when you're looking at these animals and what they would naturally do. And sometimes it's a surprise to you too. We're like, well, let's see how beneficial it really is. Like, let's try it. And ultimately, if we're looking for investment, you're not taking out a second mortgage of your home to give your animals the correct level of lighting. Right. And if the key benefit is now you're breeding animals that have never bred before, or your rates are up, or they're overall healthier, they're more active, I think that's a win-win all across the board from everybody. And then you get into doing the right lights, and all of a sudden you have a planted enclosure, and which you can't do with just a UV light, right? Like you can't expect your plants to thrive with just a normal tube, like a fluorescent tube. The animal will be gaining benefits, but overall, your plant growth suffers, or just doesn't look great, right? Like UVC bulbs by themselves, they don't look great. We have to add an element of visible light for it to be even remotely appealing for us. Otherwise, they're in a relatively dark cage. Like we could do lights that just do UVA and UVB with very little visible light, but it's not great. Like no one's winning on that one.
It's funny you say that, because I had a student one time who I did the lecture. I mean, when I do the hardcore UVB lecture, the lab for this course it's a 3-hour block, and like I start and 3 hours later I end. I mean, it is like, so that, it basically is, it makes UVB seem like this godlike thing. And then you hand them the light bulb after they've learned all this stuff, and you turn it on, and it's like, like, and I have had students be like, that's it? Like, that's what? And so that then, like, that's where you get into like, it's not putting out visible light. In fact, the light you see from the light bulb is just kind of added there, so you know that it's on. Like, So then when the visible light comes into play, do you want to kind of segue to what visible light is compared to the others and why it's important? Because it serves another function when it comes to the biology of these animals.
Yeah. If we're looking at from the keeper perspective, it's almost exclusively perception of the environment, right? Like if I'm investing in this animal and this part of my family in my home, I want this entire thing to look the way it is. But when we start looking at how the animal interacts with its environment, like they don't see the same way that we see, right? Like I think that's relatively established. But on the visible light side, when we start looking at prey items, right? Like when we start looking at other vertebrates, when we start looking at arthropods, for example, when we start looking at vegetation, like you'd be shocked by the amount of different types of light on how an animal will be like, oh, I've never wanted to eat that before, but all of a sudden now it looks appetizing. But as far as like a physiological standpoint goes, I don't want to say we're in the infancy stages of the correct levels of visible light. I think we're constantly getting better. I've seen stuff go from what we've been working on 10 years ago, like I think we've hit it, to all of a sudden like, well, yeah, but we can do better now. Like we can make sure that the correct visible light is out there. We can get the reds and the yellows, right? Like we could do those RGBs on when it comes down to like LED lighting or fluorescent lighting or mercury vapor lighting. We could get that color palette really, really locked in. But for the most part, I don't know if we're ever going to be perfect when it comes to visible light, but that's how we perceive things, right? Like when we go out there, almost all of what we're viewing and how we interact and how we feel is on the visible light spectrum. Reptiles, amphibians, avians, a little bit of a different story.
Yeah. If you really want to see the impact of like why lighting is important is that, and I feel like this is a truth that any company that makes lights would say, like, nothing will ever equal the sun. It's impossible. No. Like it is literally what drives our biosphere, for crying out loud. Like we can't replicate that. And I know we're kind of bouncing outside of colubrids, but I was raising a tegu for Zooside. This tegu's name was Mort. And Mort like ran around my feet at this desk I sit at when I record. I put a baby gate up. I did the thing where I would wear a t-shirt and throw it on the ground, and Mort would like roll in it and then realize that's my smell. And everybody at West Liberty was like, oh, Mort loves you. And I was like, well, I don't know if Mort loves me, but Mort definitely knows that I'm the food monkey. And so, and she would absolutely come to me because they're smart. They're basically reptile dogs, but never showed a speck of aggression. And so I purchased Mort in the winter. And so it's like the first warm day in March. And I had her, and she's like 20 inches long. And I thought it'd be really cool to take her outside. So I took her outside, and I know that was the first time every neuron in her brain fired because the sun hit her, and little delicate Mort turned into a freaking demon because everything was working, and it was almost like hyperstimulation. Like it was like a panic response.
It's a werewolf, it's a werewolf under a full moon.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. That's it. Nailed it. And then this thing's like spinning and trying to bite. And at first I thought, oh God, but I realized it was almost like the animal was panicking because these elements of its biology were for the first time on. And a really fun story, same situation, only orders of magnitude worse. And I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to. We have a 6-foot water monitor. And we put a harness on the water monitor and thought it'd be really cool to take it out on the quad. And of course, the first time we do this, I'm not being sexist, but I was like, Eli, he was one of our students that was about 6 foot to 240. I was like, you're going to take Norbert, the water monitor, outside. And what I didn't know is that he took with him Amanda, who was about 110 pounds. And for some unknown reason, handed the water monitor off to Amanda and then went back inside. And that water monitor, it like sat out there. And according to, infamy, it spent about a minute and a half, like, whoa, just like looking around. And then it just slowly turned its head to Amanda and was like, I can eat you. And then basically like charged her. And Eli like had to run around and like just elicited a completely different behavior in that animal that we had never seen before or since. And I've taken the monitor out a couple times since. I made sure I was wearing Carhartt overalls. Like I was ready. And, he was definitely, though, it's just crazy to see these animals' responses when you basically activate those physiological pathways. So that is why, to me, it has always bothered me deeply when people say it doesn't do anything, it's not important, And another thing I want to talk about with this lighting issue, which is something that we've studied a lot at the school, is we've studied stress in reptiles. And that's cortisol levels or, corticosterone levels if it's in a reptile. And one of the things that we know radiation does is when you are stressed out, you go outside, you most of the time kind of just, and that's what this radiation does. And one of the things I've always wondered is like when if you have animals that are kind of permanently stressed, their immune system's going to drop. Mm-hmm. And if their immune system's going to drop, they're going to be sick. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we know about crypto, the dreaded crypto for colubrid keepers everywhere, is that the animal will go forever and then it gets stressed out. And then, the crypto
boom.
Pop. Yep. Yeah. And I've often wondered if we're giving them this radiation, maybe that's some kind of natural physiological way to kind of keep that corticosterone level down, which might be a way to kind of inhibit, if the animal has crypto, it expressing. Now, I do not want anybody to interpret this as Zach Loafman said, if you use UVB, you're not going to have crypto. I'm not
put your
saying
snake
that.
in the sun and it
Yes.
cures crypto. So,
I'm not saying that. I'm saying as a scientist, though, I sit here and I think like, And if I think about like where the people that seem to get crypto the most are people that are keeping these animals in rack settings.
mm-hmm.
But then you like look at that and it could be that that's not what's causing it. It's the mere fact that you're in a rack setting and the proximity from animal A to B to C to D.
And how many
so
are in
close.
one room and that kind
Yeah.
of thing. Yeah. That makes sense.
But I know that when I was, I talked to somebody about crypto in their collection last week. I kind of got a reputation for that, but I always ask, and I've had people literally say, well, I was keeping them in enclosures and then I decided to go big and then I moved them into a rack. And then I got crypto, but I don't know if that's because they were denied this light because they were keeping it. The one instance, they were basically full blown bioactive and went to a rack. But anyway, I just think this stuff, if you're going to be a good herpetoculturalist, you have to consider it. You cannot just say, that's the way we always did it. Like, you want to talk about like,
yes,
I'm done. Like, you
so
be quiet and leave the conversation.
So
we're not having it.
You both have said something that it reminds me of a story, and it's actually going to take me into the next question I'm going to have for you, Steve. So, Steve, you had said that you made the point, we're never going to have it perfect, but we can always make it better, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Zach, to the point you just made, this is the way I've always done it. Okay. And that's a mentality we have to get away from. And that's a piece of advice I will give everyone in your life, period. I don't care if we're talking about reptiles, but that mentality, this is the way we've always done it, that is the doom to so much. And I'm going to go on a little tangent here, and I don't think I've shared this story on the podcast before. However, most people are not aware that the year that Netflix bought the digital rights to all those thousands of movies and television shows. Because if you remember, Netflix used to be a DVD delivery, right? The year that they bought all those digital rights and went streaming, all those rights were offered to Blockbuster first.
Yeah, I know this.
Blockbuster did not purchase them, but not everyone knows why. The reason Blockbuster did not purchase those digital rights, one, they didn't think they were necessary because we've always done it this way. And two, because if they would have made that purchase, it would have lowered their profitability that year because of the money they spent, and the executive team would not have bonused to the same degree. We always did it this way, and our arrogance. That right there. Those two things. How's Blockbuster doing today? Because of that one decision and that one thought of the way we've always done it is going to always work. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I love that you just said that, Steve, that we can always make it better, because the moment, a person or especially a company thinks in the direction of it can't get any better, well, that's when you're playing Blockbuster to someone else's Netflix kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so because of, that, as soon as you said that, that's where my mind started going was, yes, you have to think like that. So because of that, I want to know the story, I guess, the thought process or the why of Terra Sky, because that obviously is something you guys have just launched. Zach and I have got to play with it, and we both I've seen some really cool things out of it. So I guess I want to know where that came from. Why was it necessary? Why was it created?
Yeah. So I could kind of go tag onto your comment too about meeting people. You have to take a two-pronged approach, right? You have to meet them where they're at or meet them where they're going. You don't want to meet them where they've been. Yeah. And I think that we kind of take that pride. So most people don't realize this about us as a company. Like, we're all keepers, right? Our management, when it comes to Exo Terra, from just the reptile side of our business, are all keepers. You know, we've got a couple of people here in the U.S. and then our R&D facility and our product development office is in Europe. So when we do things, in the one hallmark that we've always kind of fallen on is all of our product development, or a good chunk of it, comes from being researched in the wild. Like we've done, I don't know how many research expeditions globally that we've done over the years. It's been a few years since, but they almost always lead to product development. So when we start looking at, okay, what can we do and what can we build? What can we bake with the ingredients that are available to us right now, right? Like how many more ingredients? What are my cooking tools to make something like this happen? So that, I think that's one part of it, right? Like you've got the mad scientist side where you start looking at, well, I can do it, so let's see what happens. And then you've got the you got the realistic, the business side of it. Is it a product that has a necessity in the market? Is there a reason for it? And more importantly, is this where we are going as a hobby? Is this where we're going as an industry? So if we look at LED lighting as a whole, and I don't know for how many aquarists you have out there that are in like the fish keeping side. I remember the conversation 15 plus years ago where no one wanted to get away from like T5 fluorescent lighting from planted aquariums, right? And a lot of it was, we have these LED lights over my aquarium that are retailing for $1,500, and they don't look that much better than what I'm using. That, true for the moment. But more importantly, I think it's the challenges that we're facing as a whole from the industry, and then trying to find some major solutions. So when it comes to LED lighting, I wouldn't say that a single product line has been in development for a decade, but we have been toying with LED lighting for a long time. And then as we started getting closer, we're like, this isn't going to work. Let's drop this side of it. Let's move on to what's available. And because LED lighting is basically tied to microchips, you start looking at, okay, so basically these are don't look at it like a fluorescent light or a basking light. Think of them as miniature computers. Now we can do what we weren't able to do 12 months ago, right?
Yeah.
Years ago. So we finally got to a point where like we've seen the impact of launching items too early. We've been very guilty of it, like I said, with the reptile vision bulb that we did. Amazing product. I wish it had succeeded. Just the industry wasn't ready for it. But now we're at can we launch something that is incredibly beneficial? And then that's phase one. And then we start looking at, can we continue to make it better as we advance? So that part of it kind of clears up the product development side, right? It is we can do this. We see a need. We see a want. We start looking at the ugly side of the industry, which is listen, for decades when it came down to, for those of us that remember like Vitalite, right? Like Vitalite in the 80s and 90s, like that was all you had. And then, we have our, other industries that are other reptile product manufacturers that came in with their versions, and then other ones. And then all of a sudden we had zoo style enclosure or lamps that came out in like HID versions or mercury vapor versions. So, but there are challenges because all of a sudden we might not be able to use those indefinitely. So if it comes to LED, and I'm not saying I'm not a catastrophist here when I'm looking at reptile products and that what could potentially harm our hobby, but if we start looking at always only working with what is available to us, and that something happens where that gets taken away, we're being very, very naive to taking leaps and bounds and risks, right, into moving over into broader categories. So that's kind of where we were with the LED UVB story. It became like a combination of all of those things. There's a potential, if I might be miswording this, it might be imminent, mercury ban coming up in Europe, which may or may not, I would need to double check this, maybe 2027 or so, which could greatly impact the manufacture and import of items that contain mercury. So we're looking at metal halide bulbs, which HID bulbs. We're looking at compact fluorescence. We're looking at linear fluorescence. We're looking at mercury vapor, and all of those bulbs contain some level of mercury in order for them to make it work, along with the phosphors and everything else in order to create UV lighting. So if we look at that as a whole, and we are limited by what we could provide our pets or our animals, what other direction do you have to go? Right? Like you have to go for what's available. And the buzzword now is LED. It was compact fluorescent 10 years ago, right? Every hardware store you went into, you don't find normal heat lamps anymore. They were all some level of fluorescent lamps. So that's where the UVB and the LED story kind of started morphing a little bit. And we were like, okay, so we can do it right. We could take some moderate risks when we look at what we're developing, and then we can use what's worked with us. We can use what's done on the science side in order to create the best possible version with the ingredients that are available to us right now. And there are limitations to technology. When it comes to LED, UVB in general, I know that, we follow everything, right? Like we've got pushback. We've had questions from our own sales teams, including myself on the marketing side. We start looking at, okay, so where are the hurdles that we're going to experience when it comes to this LED lighting? One of the biggest hurdles that we saw, which I think we're fighting a battle that we were not a participant in, which is when you prematurely launch something without vetting the development process, or without looking at the potential problems, which can be a little blinding sometimes, right? Like you have your horse blinders on because you're working on what you're working on and it's got to work. We've been working on it for X amount of years. It's got to work. Is now all of a sudden there's a stigma to a particular type of lighting due to a single case or a number of cases because things weren't taken into account. These were all things that we were already working against. But at the same time, we're like, yeah, but we solved this problem. Like, this is not a problem with the style of lighting that we had. So to kind of get into now to bring that home on what we did with the Terra Sky UV lamps is we were like, okay, so we have to have some type of lamp and LED fixture where it's safe to use at a given distance, right? And that can be problems with LEDs because even though it's a tiny microchip, it's a tiny diode, a lot of those pack a lot of punch when it comes to output, whether it's UV output or visible light. So something, I don't know for your listeners who are aware, but our parent company, Hagen, also has Fluval Aquatics. And we've been using for years a manufacturing process where our LED lighting has a 120-degree light dispersion. So imagine all of a sudden you have a very finite amount of light and radiation going downwards. It's very powerful underneath this, for lack of a better term, umbrella. But if you widen that, all of a sudden you're mixing that and you could get a lot closer to this light. You could also do a lot more and light and penetrate much, much further into the terrarium or environment itself. So that was one of the big things where we decided, okay, we can do this, right? We can do this with the technology that's available to us right now. We can make something that's a lot safer to use. And we broadened it out a little bit. Another thing that we ran into when it comes to LED lighting as a whole is to make sure that it's safe if something happens to the bulb, whether that's a water issue or humidity issue, or whether that's like a dust and mineral buildup issue. And, we have ours, believe it's IP54 rated, which is basically it's independent rating industry that makes it relatively waterproof or watertight as you're using it. So if you have it over a chameleon enclosure, for example, or aquatic turtle, you can rest assured that the water or the mineral buildup isn't going to affect the function of that light, whether it's visible or UV itself. So another one of those things that we really took a look at because it's going to be a problem if we don't fix it, right? Like we're fixing problems that have already existed. And then we start getting into the fun side. Now the mad scientist side is, okay, so we have to do something, and this goes back to one of the points I made earlier. We have to do something that is incredibly digestible, right? Like it's got to make sense to the end consumer or the end user. And most of that also goes into the transparency side of things where you provide the amount of information. So to go back to your Ferguson comment, so all of the UVB lighting and especially UVB LED, the original lighting charts that we developed that includes your lux, your UVA, your UVB, all of those in your microwatts per square centimeter, international units of D3, all of that is there. But we also provide a radiation chart that gives you your UVI, so your UV index, and your Ferguson zone index as well. So now all of a sudden it's like, at any given distance and depth away from these lamps, what your output is. So really, really cool but you have to do that when it comes to something new like this. Like you have to provide all of the information as possible. And then we rely on people that we've worked with saying like, hey, listen, I want your full disclosure. whatever you want to tell me, whether you like or dislike about this, about this fixture, because we want to hear it. It helps us with product development. Sometimes we've already heard it or we're aware of it, but most of the time trust me, we're not offended by a challenge. It's the only way we're going to get better. Not just Exo Terra, but as an industry, it's like, this is a problem. You mentioned crypto and some of the ways to mitigate that. And sometimes, is it a UV lamp? Maybe, right? Is it a heat related issue? Is it a space related issue? Maybe it's all of those in concert with each other. But overall, when it comes to something like this, this is great for what it is. Doesn't necessarily mean that we're not working on better. And I think that often gets a little mistranslated when it comes down to launching products, is like, guys, the technology and the development will catch up with what's happening right now. So that's one side of the product development scale. The other one is, some of the other, I'm sure you guys are probably going to ask about this too. So might as well get ahead while I'm on my soapbox. But when we start looking at the full spectrum lighting, right, it's a big thing when you look at some of the stuff that's coming out of the European testers out there and the keepers, all of it's relevant data. Now, are there limitations to what's available out there that are best in show or best in market, like T5 lighting, compact fluorescent, metal halide? 100%. But because there hasn't been a ton of aftermarket testing on LED lighting, it's really hard to say that this is the greatest thing that's ever existed. That being said, does anyone else remember any other testing procedures when it comes to any other type of UV lighting in the reptile? It's never happened. So, you kind of have to look at, this is the data set that we're providing out there for everyone to take a look at. Yeah. And then fully understanding that there are major limitations to LED lighting currently when it comes to UV overall. And one of the big things, I kind of talked about this a little earlier when it came down to the misconception or the misperception of UV LED right now, was when you rush a product sometimes, or you don't take everything into account and you start looking at the short wavelength UVB lighting, which is why there's the buzzword about UVC, right? Yeah. LED, it's all of a sudden now you're married to this thing and it's really hard to get divorced away from it. But we were able to take care of that during the product development process, because we really narrowed down our bandwidth our wavelength of UVB. So we're in the 308 nanometer range, which is the most efficient range you can get for vitamin D3 production. So we're particular about making sure that we're plugging those holes that LED UVB lighting has. The other side of it, and Zach, I'm not sure whether you've kind of mentioned this, but I'm sure you guys have gone over like the UVA2 spectrum. Yeah. In reptile lighting, and it's something that no type of lighting has got it even close to perfect yet. They've got it manageable, right? What's available on the market is manageable. Unfortunately, LED UVB lighting, from where we sit today on Tuesday, July 9th, there's just nothing that we can do in that wavelength range. But it's kind of like a catch-all. Like, that wavelength range is only really relevant if your UVB is not dialed in. So, for example, if you're erring on the side of moving too far to the left or too far to the right of UVB radiation, then you start looking at hypervitaminosis D, right? Or hypercalcemia. And in those situations, if the animal is suffering from that, whether it's a supplementation issue or your lighting isn't dialed in, then the D3 regulatory range of UVA2 is incredibly important. So it's a problem. Now, from what we've found on this side is, of course, we would love to include that range. Like, if it's available and it's possible, it will happen. It might happen much sooner than we're anticipating too. But we're pretty confident in making sure that we're playing in the right sandbox with the correct wavelength of UV radiation as is, so that that's not going to become a problem later on. So that kind of, in a nutshell, at least from the UVB side, not the UVA side, is kind of why we did what we did and why we launched when we launched. It is let's look at what happened during the stumbling blocks over the last 2 years, right, on what's available out there. Let's fix what we can fix, and let's advance where we can advance which is why we came out with the Terra Sky UV. You've got basically virtually a bioactive fixture, right? So you could do all your plant life on it.
Yeah.
It's got a myriad of features that we don't necessarily need to go in a list on. But we figured some things out. Where we are limited, we did include stuff that we think is very cool. And Zach, you might find this fascinating too. I think you might have spoken to our digital coordinator, Logan Hope, about this with our UVA1 chip. Mm-hmm. So we could, because we did it, we did it because we could, but we included a biofluorescent UVB LED or UV LED inside of the lamp. So stuff that is, as we mentioned with the Burkhesia species, with snakes overall and how they perceive their environment and themselves, chameleons in particular, a lot of iguanids that use, color markers, anole species. You look at all of these animals that use coloration or flash patterns in order to interact with opposite sex, right? Opposite sex animals. All of a sudden now, how they perceive things is very, very different, including activity levels. So we'll release more of our testing once it's all been done, but we do have major experts testing our product. Sometimes we hear stuff that we don't want to hear. We're like, we know, we'll get to it when we can. But then we have an ongoing behavioral experiment with a really well-known name that's looking under the basking over UVA. So what we found and what they've been able to share with us so far, same thing as you mentioned, Clint, too, with your with the tiger rat snakes, I think you mentioned, is we find the animal basking under the UVA specific LEDs early in the morning, way before they even get to a basking spot under their heat lamps, which is wild, right? Because we're just assuming it's all happening at one time. They're looking for heat, but we found out with like Ari's research, with other animals that we're working on, including some of the stuff in my own office, is you have animals that are searching for this stuff almost like a hunger, and all of a sudden, like, this is weird. Why is my animal basking under an LED light that's producing virtually no heat at 8:05 in the morning?
Yeah.
They're probably telling you something, buddy, right? Like, they're probably telling you that there's something that is missing in what we're providing. And if we could provide these specific wavelengths that you can't necessarily do with different types of lamps that use either phosphorus or mercury, let's do it, right? Let's make what's best for the animal and try to do something that's a little off the wall that will push the industry forward, that will cause it to evolve. And then all of a sudden it's like, I think Exo Terra has it there, but maybe we can up it the next level. And then we come back going, this is our sandbox. We want to up it again. And then we have this gigantic game, for lack of a better term, of evolution and innovation. And that's where we want to be, I think, as an industry, is continuing to push forward, not do what we've always done. Some things work, but other things overall, I think we're getting to a point where we're having fun again. We're having fun with the products, and then overall you get results like the tiger rat snakes, right? Or Boelen's pythons, or some of the animals that I'm working with on the Madagascan leaf-tailed gecko side. Like, some of the results I have, I'm like, that's weird. Like, that's new. Diameter of the eggs improve. Using the chalk sacks a lot more efficiently. Breeding. Much I guess more often than they would. And by the way, I have one fixture that's taking care of my plants and my UV light. I've got nighttime heating in there. I've got my UVA, and all of a sudden you got you've got your Honda Accord. Do you want a Ferrari? Of course, but I've got a pretty meaningful and reliable item and car in front of me right now. At some point, we'll be able to make it better.
That's really cool.
And I've mentioned this on a previous episode. So two different species that we put the Terra Sky on. And the first we turned on was green-killed lizards. And again, they had already had UV on them. And we put this on, and I actually hadn't even turned the other UV off yet. I was programming this, and they instantly shot over and just started to bask under that LED. And, it's obvious that we're certainly hitting something that they weren't getting before with that other spectrum that you were discussing. Now, my first thought was, obviously, well, that's really cool. They like it. Now, I'm also thinking, I know these green-killed lizards, and they're a curious little species. Especially when they're used to us. So, I mean, if we go putting our hands in there, they kind of want to run up our arms and that type of thing. They're neat. And so that was my thought was, part of this may be there's something new, they're checking things out. Right. But they stayed there and basked for a while. Now, panther chameleons, on the other hand, especially, I had 10 baby panther chameleons in a big enclosure, and they aren't as curious. They just want to get the hell away from you. Yeah. Anything new, anything moving that's not a bug, they either just want to sit still or they start doing that kind of dance, walk that they do when they're trying to scoot away from you. However, that was the second thing that we put the Terra Sky on. And not only did every one of those babies boogie up towards the top of the cage, towards it, 6 out of the 10 actually went all the way to the screen to climb and just hang from the screen directly underneath it. So there is certainly something to be said about that other spectrum that it's lighting up for them. Because I think I can't say that it's all just what they're absorbing, because that was really fast for them to react to it. It's almost like there had to be some other visual cue to them as well, that they're obviously seeing something, because there's no way they could have felt it. That, the ones that were on the other side of the enclosure, you're talking a 36 high, that kind of thing. It wasn't a, oh my God, feeling. It was, they saw it and they darted over to it because it was something intriguing. So I think it's definitely, it's incredible, honestly, on seeing that behavioral change that fast in what they're doing.
It's instant, right? When something like that turns on and you see something like that, it's almost like you ultimately you go skeptical and you're like little snake oil, right? Like little it can't be that quick. But I think we took a lot of that into account when we came out to the big year. So we launched 3 versions of the Terra Sky UV. 2 of them were screw-in lamps, like one's a spot, one's a horizontal one that goes over the fixtures of our terrariums. But I think the biggest part, I don't know why I didn't mention this first, is the Terra Sky UV, the light fixture, the actual linear one that will go over most terrariums, is fully controllable on UVB, UVA, and white light overall. So instead of just having, if you have a need for one in particular, you can reduce or increase it in 10% increments. So which is kind of what's been really cool on, for my office and some of the research I've been doing here. So, I got, I guess, lucky because I've been working with them for over a year before they launched. Yeah. And I've been able to keep them over mantella frogs that I was working with golden mantellas. I have a handful of Europlatus species. I was working on some like it a little more intense than others. Work with 3 or 4 different Euromastic species, and then you throw in a bearded dragon too, right? Got to throw in that bearded dragon just to get a base.
I'm about to say that's what most, the most popular one out there. So So it's kind of neat that you got something that you can adapt on the fly without having to, as a store, a retailer too. It's, listen, we're giving you one item that'll be a catch-all for most enclosures, right? Or I can give you 15. That's one per every size enclosure, right? One per every type of animal. And, I hope, and Zach, this goes into especially your level of expertise when it comes to this, is I think the fun thing about it from looking at it like a toy is being able to work with each of those things individually.
Oh, God,
right? Yeah. So if you've got like so if you got like a montane species, gets a little less visible light, but their UV, the UV exposure is so much higher, which we don't think. Like as people, it should be bright and UV, but it's actually darker. You got a lot more cloud cover, but you get sunburn like crazy. I've been to places where I've traveled, like I've been to New Zealand a handful of times, and I've been out there. I'm like, it feels like I'm 10 feet from the sun. Like, this is crazy. It's 72 degrees outside and relatively overcast, and it feels like I'm that close. So to be able to play with that and to look over animals, especially with the stuff that you guys work with, that is a primary focus of the podcast, and we look at animals that are darker, that absorb more visible light, more infrared heat, right? Like Mexican black king snakes, for example. And you start looking at these animals that would naturally they're built to absorb light, right? Yep. They're however long they are out in nature, out from their hiding spots, like they do absorb quite a bit of it. So you can do that. at some point, the rest of the industry will catch up. Maybe they'll have other controllable units. Maybe we'll move from that, that Honda over to the Ferrari at some point with our next version. Who knows? Sky's kind of the limit. But I think that's where we need to go with offering all of that is here's your Ferguson levels, right? Like here's everything at any given distance. Here's your UVA. Here's how UV helps sterilize reptile skin, which again, we kind of went over with the stress side, not just, I don't want to say that it just all of a sudden it cures everything, but it does help with the level of sterilization that you can't necessarily get in a plastic tub with some wood chips, right? It's your snake might be healthy and clean overall, but you're not getting that extra impact of what lighting does. So it's fun. It's fun being on this side of it right now, being a little bit in the driver's seat. But what happens is when you're, it's like, what is it? Crabs in a bucket or lobsters in a bucket. The higher you get, the more, the quicker it is to kind of pull you down. So we're anticipating that the rest of the industry will kind of catch up. We are hoping that the legislative wing of things will slow down a little bit, or we've got enough experts and zookeepers and, academics that really carry a bigger voice than the pet industry overall. Make sure that they weigh in on these topics where the LED lighting will be an addition to how we care for our animals versus this is all we have left. I don't have a crystal ball, so unfortunately I can't really say too much on that, but we're conscious of it and we're aware of it during the product development process.
Do you mind, and I don't know if this is a road you want to go down or not, but do you mind talking a little bit about this upcoming legislation that kind of hit herpetoculture? I don't want to say out of left field, but I do know I was emailed by a couple people that like, you need to write this person on your letterhead, and and the tone from those individuals was kind of like, whoa, I guess you didn't see this coming. Do you mind talking about the whole legislation thing and just kind of introduce that to our listeners?
I could speak to it broadly and then more specifically, like under our lens. So
there you go.
It's been a long time coming. I think it was first passed in 2022, I believe, if I remember correctly. In order to become active, I think starting, was it July 2nd or so last week, where it's starting to be enforced. Whether there's an enforcement wing or not, we don't know. So this had happened previously, maybe 10 plus years ago or so, where because the pet industry was technically considered specialty, we were relatively safe, right? Like it was specialty lamps, which they 100% are.
They still
because are. They're physiological lamps or therapeutic lamps, right? Like how we look at them, or there are special ingredients in them that cause them to act very differently than what was sold at hardware stores 25 years ago. I believe what I kind of feel happened is we were under the assumption that we would continue to be exempt because these are specialty lamps and how we communicate to the public or how the packages are being labeled. As I mentioned earlier when we first started chatting, I don't want to say we predicted this, but we were at least to the point where like this is getting a little heated in Europe too, not just in the US, where all of a sudden we start looking at this could be a bigger problem later on. Let's start not just from the care side of things, but let's start providing this information as we go forward, right? This bulb, this glass is made with neodymium, which makes it an exempt item, right? This is a UV producing lamp, which again makes it exempt. We really don't know. So Department of Energy is basically for lack of a better term, the legislative wing that this is kind of coming from. And I'm sure your audience has seen the letterhead that came out that went to most pet stores or distributors out there, which is what really caused the scare. So that's kind of where we're at. It's very similar stuff is happening in Europe as well. So I think both, continents are really looking on how we can help each other in this to have a little bit more of a unified front. But you are correct that I think that the more academics and the zookeeping community that gets involved with this, the better, because we do need that science background. From a manufacturing side, we've got money involved in it. So what we say doesn't weigh as heavy as someone like you is teaching courses, right? That's got a degree in something that's very specialized about that. But, zookeepers, especially, I mean, we're not talking about just reptiles. I mean, you use like metal halide UVB and UV penetrating metal, these giant metal halide sodium type bulbs in giant enclosures in the zoo. That falls under the same umbrella. It's not just a basking bulb that you see on shelf at a pet store. So, I'm relatively optimistic from all the conversations that I've had internally and externally that it's moving in the right direction, that DOE has been relatively receptive to what's being said, but you can't necessarily have enough qualified individuals reaching out with their own stories and with their own concerns for the well-being of our animals and on the other side is that our livelihoods. Right. Like I get, my cash is checked on the manufacturing side for the care of animals too. And I'm just as affected as someone who has 25 chameleons that they're breeding in their backyard, ultimately when it comes down to it. So yeah, that's in a nutshell, that's kind of what's happening. I don't go ahead.
Do you mind if I interject real quick?
Sure.
Do you know what's being regulated? Like why, what is wrong with the lights? Are they putting off too much CO? Like what is
the issue? So from a regulatory side, looking outside of the pet industry, it is lumens versus wattage, right? Like you have to fall under. There's a formula that once you divide your lumens by the wattage of the lamp, it has to have a particular number. If it's over that number, you have an efficient lamp. So what the agency is basically looking at is this is producing a lot of light for little power usage. And the reptile lamps or pet lamps, I feel, and I'm sure our competitive set also feels this, were miscategorized as a general use lamp. I believe that's a terminology that they're using, which they're not, right? They're really not. So they're just looking for something efficient. Overall, just for environmental reasons, this was something that pushed forward. I think it was an afterthought. The pet side, it seemed like it was more of an afterthought than this. And then all of a sudden you're like, I'll tell you, it's a lot harder to change something that's already happened than to get ahead of it ahead of time and say, hey, can we make sure that these are categorized a specific way? So, from an Exo Terra perspective, we're already working on that side of it. We've reached out to a lot of our friends and family in the industry for this whole DOE issue. I think you've seen a lot of the press that's going around to reach out to your congresspeople, your senators as well. I don't know if it's there yet. It doesn't hurt, but I think it's more of a DOE thing. If there can be some level of an exemption where now these are considered specialty bulbs, everything will go lockstep. It's boom, boom, boom. These are infrared, right? These are UV produced bulbs. These are special colored bulbs, which are like neodymium UVA bulbs. And then all of them go into those classes of exempt status. But it's going to be, it's becoming a problem getting out of that general use category.
Well, in two things I hope our listeners take away from this is one, if you are going to get involved, if you're going to write legislators, if you're going to write, DOV, be respectful.
Be respectful.
Okay? It's, this isn't something to go, because quite honestly, what they are pushing for makes sense, right? If you take out the need for the pet industry on it, they're wanting more energy efficient bulbs to be produced, and to make that, a requirement that makes sense as a society, right?
Yes, it does.
So I support that. What we're, saying in this hobby, in this industry, in this discipline is simply that this is a segment that we need these specialized bulbs to be able to continue to do what we're doing with these animals. So that's the message we want to say is, we agree with the legislation except for this part, right? This reasoning. So again, be respectful in your communication, be factual, be intelligent, in how you word things. So, make sure you're not going to be someone that just pisses somebody off, because a pissed off person is less likely to do what you're wanting them to do. Right. So, But yes, and that's the one thing I hope that people understand too, is it's not a bad law. It's not a bad piece of legislation. It just has a piece in it that needs some refining.
Agreed.
So.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Some people carry more weight than others when it comes to this topic, but to stay engaged is helpful overall, right? Just to kind of be up in it. I can tell you, since we caught word of this, it's been nonstop question after question. And I've had official responses sent out. We've had things like this where it's been one-on-one conversations. It is a concern. And it's a viable concern, but we're hopeful that this thing plays itself out in the correct direction. And if for some reason it does not, we just have to be prepared to pivot a little bit, or to make sure that this thing at least gets buried into, or taken, our segment of the hobby kind of gets pulled away from it and kind of considered its own little thing, because It's not just this, right? We got to look at, I'll use an example, like Tractor Supply, right? Like a company that does a lot of farm goods and everything. And how many baby chicks do they sell in ducks a year, where they have these heat lamps? Like, how else are you going to do it? Like we're a reptile industry, but I couldn't imagine how many baby chicks are sold a year. Like I would be guessing, but it's not nothing.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Goodness. Well, crazy. Okay. Well, we're getting near the end here. Any final thoughts you want the listeners to know about? Like, where's Exo Terra going with all this? And then we'll ask you the final question that we ask everyone.
Definitely.
I'm really curious to know how that would be from your perspective.
Yeah. We are investing a lot in the reptile industry overall, especially coming out of 2020 through 2022. We're just now seeing it with the launch of these UVB LEDs, but over the course of the next probably about 6 to 8 months, I want to say we're launching something like 65 new products. Which is it's insane, and it's a lot. From a brand management perspective, it is both exciting, and it causes me to lose a lot of sleep. It's just we found that there's a lot of the industry that needs some reinvigoration a little bit. We're pushing the envelope on some things. We're looking at marketing things a little differently. We're looking at overall. We've been, I believe this is me with my company hat on. I believe the rest of the industry has caught up to what we've considered ourselves for many years. And because of that, it's kind of like, okay, now we need to take the gloves back off, go back out with some product development, start looking at like, ooh, this is really cool. Does it make sense? Does it make sense right now? Are we too early again? Are we not early enough? And then take some very, very, very calculated risks. But we'll talk more about it. There's so many things that were brought up on this episode where I'm like, oh, I wish I could talk about this. Like, I really wish I could jump in.
We will bring you back to do so.
Yes. And there's so many conversations where, like, even internally with, you guys have been dealing with Logan on the marketing side too, but he and I have been in conversations where I'll shoot him a look and I'm like, don't say it. Like, I know you want to say it, just don't, don't bring it up, or we have to talk in riddles. But overall, I think we've got a firm grasp about what we're doing. I mean, and when I say these 65 products are launching in the next 6 to 8 months, I mean, like, this isn't a sketch. Like, these are imminent. They're being manufactured right. They're being manufactured right now. Some things that the thing that I've loved about this company overall is we've always been very, very up on the pet and how the people interact with the pet. And because of that, there are times where we look at, let's just remove this line of product from our catalog overall and do it better next time. It might be our number one selling category, but it's like, yeah, but we could do better now. Like, we can, the technology's there, the affordability's there, where we're not going to kill ourselves on pricing, and we're not going to destroy the market and be like, hey, this item, I loved it. It was the store, John's Reptiles. It was their number one selling SKU. And then all of a sudden you're taking it away. Like, we don't, we try not to do that. But yeah, we have to innovate. And, sometimes innovation comes with some sacrifice too. And we have to eliminate some things from our catalog and start all over from scratch, just because there's a hole there that we think that we will fit very, very nicely into. So yeah, that's in more to come in Q4 this year, definitely heavily into Q1. I think you'll see a lot of waves from us as a brand in Q1 of next year, knock on wood, as long as there are no delays on the manufacturing side. Like we're pretty excited. And if you're an internet sleuth, there's a reason we just relaunched our website. Okay. So if you start looking at, oh, that's really cool that Exo Terra did this with their website. They're doing some interesting things here. There's some interesting links. So when you start looking at that, you're like, oh, there's little razzle dazzle that comes before what we're doing. So nice. All of it will be tied together, I think, over the next, half a year or so. And it'll become clearer on what our brand story is and how I don't want to say reinventing ourselves, but we're certainly changing our wardrobe a little bit.
So what I hear is, if I tie it back into my story earlier, Exo Terra is Netflix and that shit. That's basically what you say. You're not going to play Blockbuster is what I'm hearing. So.
No, we can't. We really can't. You have to. You're funny you're saying that, because I visited that last Blockbuster, and I think it's in Eugene, Oregon, a couple years ago with some old college friends, and it's a blast. It still has the same smell.
Oh, really?
Same smell. So there's a lot of nostalgia attached to it, but at the same time, I mean, listen, I was very apprehensive about getting rid of cable overall, and thinking I could get rid of one app, and all of a sudden I've got 10 different viewing apps, which is basically like having cable again. It's just a different way of getting the same information, right?
Yep. No. Okay. Cool.
Well, I think we need to ask him our final question. Okay.
Do you want to do it this time?
Yeah, I'll do it.
All right. Go for it.
Steve, we have a question that we ask every guest, and it's great because we get to hear so many different perspectives. And this is the first time we've had someone on your side, of the industry. So what we would like to know is, what is your take? What is your thought? Where do you see the herp hobby going? What do you see the next 5 to 10 years looking like, and what's happening with it?
Yeah. It's kind of a double-edged sword, right? It's kind of like what's happening versus what I want to happen type thing. So there are parts, and it's kind of funny because I think we've all been doing this a long time, that things get a little frustrating. Like there are things like, it doesn't feel right that it's going this direction. Mm-hmm. But overall, the thing that I do love about it, and it's happening at an increasing rate, is the fluidity of the business. Okay. Like things are changing a little bit, right? Like I remember the absolute battle on trying to explain some of the downside about keeping chameleons in screen enclosures, right? And then all of a sudden it shifts into like, well, yeah, now they need fogging devices at night. And now maybe we can cover 2/3 of the terrarium with PVC, right? And I'm like, been talking about it for way too long, but I'm glad that instead of me sitting here going like, I told you so, a lot of it ends up becoming, we're getting it. And I'm okay accepting being wrong, or not being right, if the industry is progressing and moving along. So I love the fluidity of it. I think it's great that it's happening where the pushback isn't as much there. There are still some loud voices that I think, might need a little more drowning out. But you ever heard the term, the kids are all right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kids are all right. I think it's really, I've talked to so many youngsters on the creator side, the influencer side, and just like kids at trade shows. Like I've done hundreds of trade shows in my years in this industry. And I can talk to a 8-year-old kid his parents are bringing in there, like, Exo Terra is your favorite brand, or we heard you work with this animal. He wants to ask you some questions. Like, oh yeah, of course, like anything you want to ask. And the amount of knowledge that comes out of this 8-year-old, 9-year-old kid's mouth, and I'm shocked.
Yep.
Yes.
And I'm like, and the level of research that's happening now is great. So we always want everyone to be as prepared as possible, right? And you are going to get some, Clint, I think you mentioned like the bare bones things, right? Like I just want something that's easy. This is our first pet, and there's room and space for that. those people also shouldn't be admonished or, browbeaten as well, right? Like there's some people that want to try, and this is what their means for. And we as hobbyists and keepers also have to make that very accessible for them as well. But it's incredible to me that I see these people taking this much care into setting things right and giving their animal. And we didn't touch on this, we danced around it, but the terminology that we like to use as a brand is environmental enrichment. That is so incredibly important to an animal's livelihood, their breeding behavior, and then just the happiness of us too. Like how cool is it to see these animals moving around naturally versus something that's kind of stuck in the corner. It's fat, it's pooping right, it's doing what it does. But to see it interact and move around and jump around and dig burrows, I think that's fascinating. So I'm very happy. I hope that I still have a long ways to go in this industry, but I'm very happy handing it off to some of the people that I think are going to be good stewards moving forward to this. So, I really don't have anything negative to say about the industry as a whole. I think that we all have our challenges. I think that this might shock the public, but there's a deeper connected network in the background in this industry than people assume. We talk to each other. We talk to everyone, right? It just doesn't come from a competitive set. Like legitimately, we're all rooting for the same team. Is to keep this thing that we love alive and kicking.
I've often said it's not about getting a bigger piece of the pie. It's about growing the pie.
Agreed. 100% agreed.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. Well, thank you, Steve. We'd love to have you back on.
Of course. Q1 2024, it looks like.
There we go.
Or 25, 25.
And we would be remiss if we didn't say thank you for sponsoring our show.
Absolutely.
Of course.
Yeah.
I love, what you guys do, this long format stuff where it's, you really get to get a little personal and, ask the right questions and then have the space to answer them and everything. Like, I think that this is a very necessary thing in this industry. So I'm really stoked with what you guys are doing out there. Even with Logan, our digital coordinator, on what he's been communicating with me on. It's anything that we can do to help this along. And I love it. I think it's great. It's fascinating that you guys have this relationship where you can get out there and actually talk about this stuff. And it's kind of like having a beer with someone, right? Or having a cup of coffee.
Yeah. Yeah. No, Clint and I we've mentioned it before. Like funny story for everybody to give you an insight, because a lot of people are like, Zach's busy. I think it was yesterday I had to go into a store to get something for one of the animals, and Clint messaged, you called me like 2 times, right?
Yeah, at least twice.
It was a Colubrid Fest thing, and I couldn't answer the phone because he conveniently called me both times I was at the register. I didn't tell you that. And then you called me, and I think I answered it because my university is in the middle of a cow pasture. I mean, it is literally in the middle of nowhere. And I said, I'm on the hills. I'll call you back in 15 when I get to campus. That was at 12. And I seriously could not call him back until 9:15 or 8:30 or something like that. Like 8.5 hours later, because I walked through the building front door and it was just like, whoa, boom.
Yep.
And then I had another day like that today. And you would think, oh my God, we're going to record a 2.5 hour, 2 hour, however many minutes this has been podcast. And that's exactly what it's like. It's like Clint and I and our guests and a beer. And because we just are so passionate and love this stuff.
Yeah.
It always, like, I end up, my wife actually laughs because this stuff always just invigorates me to the point where I'm on the East Coast. So it's currently 9:30 at night, and now I'm jacked up, ready to go. And then I'll probably fall asleep at 2 after putting in 2 14-hour days.
I get it. Life gets in the way, right?
Yeah. So no, this is thank you for that.
Awesome. No, thank
you.
Okay,
so if people want to find out more about you, about Exo Terra, whatever you feel comfortable with, we always ask our guests to kind of just give some information so they can kind of go beyond the episode, if you will.
Yeah. So a lot of the comings and goings from Exo Terra from the US alone is all of our socials are Exo Terra USA. So whether it's TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, I think YouTube as well. All of them have a different flavor. So we're trying to do something a little different per each one. Like, the Facebook has a little different flavor than Instagram. YouTube's going to be a little on the training side. So from a overall brand, it's normal Exo Terra. So if you're looking at what we're doing globally, and then the new website, if you want to check it out, it's really, really neat and fun to play with, but it's exo-terra.com. But on socials, if you want all the stuff specific to the US on what we're doing, it would be Exo Terra USA across the board on all platforms.
Perfect. So, as always, if you want to get a hold of me, Dr. Crawdad at Instagram, Zach Loafman on Facebook, email me. I will literally in the next, it may be up by the time we record the next episode, which is, well, we'll talk about that later. I will have the grad assistant position out. And if you want to work with Indigo Snakes for your master's degree, I'm your guy. And the project I think we may be doing, I wish that it was offered when I was going to get my master's degree, because I would have jumped all over this thing. So if you are listening, you just graduated, you want to work with me, please put that on your to-do list to keep an eye out for. And so that's me. We also want to thank the Morelia Python Radio Network and Eric. Thank you so much for hosting our show. We're very proud members of the network. And Clint, where can they find you?
You can find us on Facebook under Metazotics, Instagram, Metazotics LLC. And of course, you can always check out everything that Metazotics has to offer at metazotics.com. And if you are placing an order, please use coupon code CC Radio for a 5% discount on anything that you like.
All righty. So no matter what time of day, night, evening, afternoon you're listening to this is the way we always say it. Hope you have a good one. Thank y'all. Good night.